In this mini lecture, I'm going to be talking about some theories of gender in educational organizations. So we're going to be thinking specifically about how gender has been taken up in organizational settings, and with a particular emphasis, of course, on educational organizations. What we're going to cover then are some of the predominant theories informing discussions of gender equality and equity, equality being the same as, treating others the same as, and equity treating others within their own needs in educational organizations. So equality could be seen as treating equals equally, and equity is treating unequals unequally. I always like to illustrate this by talking about my two kids, one of whom is diabetic and one of whom is not. If I were to treat them equally, I would, in fact, kill one or the other, depending on what I decided to do about providing insulin. So we can't always, in all circumstances, treat people equally in order to be fair. So this is what we're getting at here. So how do these theories inform discussions of gender equality and equity in educational organizations? And what are some of the connections between some of those ideas and the three readings, and between those three readings as well, Connell, Wallace, and Young? So I'm going to look at those in this mini lecture. So first of all, let's talk about feminist theory. Now, the word feminism, of course, is one that always evokes very strong reactions, and understandably so, because it's speaking about a fundamental reorganization of society in many ways. And we've already talked about how deeply entrenched those gender norms are. So when we talk about changing those, of course, it's going to evoke very strong reactions. But what do we really mean by feminism? Well, of course, there's many definitions, but this is one I like, and I think it speaks to much of what we're going to be talking about in this course. That feminism is the global idea of feminism refers to the belief that men and women deserve equality in all opportunities, treatment, respect, and social rights. In general, feminists are people who try to acknowledge social inequality based on gender and stop it from continuing. Feminists point out that in most cultures throughout history, men have received more opportunities than women. So as a result of that definition, and if we accept that definition, then we know that most of the theories that we're going to be talking about will be speaking about women in particular, but we're speaking across genders. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about women, men, and those who fall on the spectrum between. The first is liberal feminism. And liberal feminism is simply talking about rights feminism. This is predominantly what informed first wave feminism and what informed early iterations of feminism in the second wave as well. And liberal feminism concerned itself with issues of, for example, underrepresentation of women in particular occupations. So we have lots of women represented in teaching, for example, but we don't have many women, or as many women, represented in administration. So this became one of the issues that was taken up within liberal feminism. Radical feminism is a feminism that goes back to the etymology of the word radical. That is the root. The root of feminist concern are patriarchy. And within patriarchy, then, there needs to be a reordering so that the law of the father that has been taken up in the law of male authority in a wider society needs to be reshaped and basically ignored, and a new order needs to be taken up. Very radical feminists would see themselves as completely separate from male domination or male norms. Others would find a way in between. But it's an interesting concept to actually think through what would that actually look like, and what would that mean. And it's an interesting intellectual exercise. Critical or socialist feminism looks at the systems that hold gender bias and gender lack of opportunity, gender inequity in place, and looks at it from the perspective of communal responsibility to make changes to the systems that hold gender norms in place and works to change them. Now, I'm doing a disservice to all of these because I'm talking about them very briefly. We'll take them up in greater detail in other classes in the course, but I just want to kind of lay out the framework for you so that you have an opportunity to kind of know some of the language if you don't already, and be able to place it somehow. The last we're going to talk about, the fourth that we're going to talk about is post-colonial feminism, because one of the huge critiques, and a very valid critique, is that early feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism, critical socialist feminism even, did not consider the effects of colonialism, did not consider those who are other than white women in a dominant North American society. It really concerned itself with a very particular population, and post-colonial feminism pushes back on that and exhorts feminists and and feminist theory to consider the broader world and to consider the ways in which Black women, minority women of other ethnicities have been displaced in a very particular kind of way, doubly and triply marginalized because of not only their gender but also their race. And also exploring the effects of colonialism on where they have been placed in society. Post-structuralist feminism is certainly one that has become perhaps a dominant theme, a dominant theory in feminism. It's very difficult to describe and talk about in a brief way, but I'll make a stab at it here. Basically, what post-structuralist feminism talks about is that discourses create social reality. Discourses are those language and particular kinds of language that hold meaning, and that meaning holds us kind of hostage to particular norms. So post-structuralist feminism would push back on that and suggest that we need to shift, we need to understand the discourses that hold us in place in particular kinds of ways and push back on that and consider other possibilities within those discourses. I've done a really terrible job of explaining that, and I'll come back to that later, but I just wanted to kind of lay it out very briefly. So what I've done in choosing these readings then is to pick up on some of these theoretical perspectives. And since the first and arguably still the dominant theoretical perspective within feminism, certainly in administration and policy studies, is liberal feminism. And what Connell is doing is a kind of interesting trick, because what he's exploring are the discourses within organizations that hold these gender norms in place. And then he's pushing back on what are essentially liberal feminist policies. So I'll explain that by saying that liberal feminist policies, rights policies, have argued that women have a right to hold equal positions with men in organizations, and that we need to assist women in finding those places. So he argues that organizations themselves are gendered, and those organizations are, in essence, a series of discourses, and those discourses, like hierarchy, like bureaucracy, those bureaucratic discourses, those hierarchical discourses, hold gender regimes in place. In fact, they maintain them in very particular ways. When we talk about leadership in particular kinds of ways, we're talking about it in a gendered way because it reflects a particular gendered reality. So, and in the reading, he talks about that more. So I just want to kind of touch on that. But what he wants to look at in particular are the effects of gender equity policies. Now, it's interesting because R.W. Connell is a writer who is herself transgendered, is someone who has been very involved in gender politics in Australia. And Australia has very interesting history around gender equity policy. They actually, at one point, and for about several years, I think it was at least 10 years, insisted that there be at least a significant enough population of women, feminist women, in various policy domains throughout the government, so that that voice became a part of the policy making within the state. Um, and so, you know, this was a very avant-garde almost experiment in making sure that gender analysis was a part of policy analysis and policy implementation. But what happened over time is the ideologies of various governments pushed that aside. So what he argues is that state policies govern gendered actors, and that the ideology that holds that government in place, or that has caused that government to be put in place, is going to shape then the kinds of policies that occur. So if there's a more open notion around gender, then you're going to have these feminists who in your policy bureau who are going to be able to bring that perspective to policy making around the embodied gendered actor in the public and private sphere. But if you have more conservative governments, which is the case now, then it's going to look very different, and policies are going to become gendered in a quite different way. So he cautions that it's important to pay attention to that. He then says that gender equity policies that emerged in the 60s disappeared in the 90s, and we find that in Canada as well. Their effectiveness was limited because organizational mechanisms didn't change. Hierarchy didn't change, means of authority didn't change, bureaucracies didn't change. So even though the policies may have been different, the mechanisms by which gendered activities or gendered understandings were held in place were not changed. So in essence, nothing changed significantly over time. Even when organizational structures changed, that should be cultural connection between power and masculinity remained. So what he says then is that gender transitions evoke strong emotions that are difficult to deal with in policy because we've got organizational processes, practices, discourses holding these gender regimes in place. And we have lots of other social networks that are holding them in place as well. So when you try to change that, you're going to be met with very strong reactions. Thus, while there may be changes in labor processes in the organizations that he studies in this paper, without corresponding changes in the levels of consciousness, emotions will continue to grate against gendered changes in authority. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop this video there, and I'm going to start another one so that we can go through my paper and also Beth Young's paper. So this is the end of this video, and you can go to video 2 to pick up the rest.